President Biden is reportedly expressing regret for dropping out of the 2024 presidential race. According to the report, Biden believes he could have beaten Trump if he wasn't pushed out by his own party. Lucas Tomlinson is live in St. Croix. That's lovely, where Biden is spending the holidays. Lucas.
Good afternoon, Tammy. President Biden's approval rating remains around 39%. It's been underwater since that hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan. But as you mentioned, it doesn't appear to have stopped some of his aides. You say Biden should not have dropped out of the race and said the president thinks the same thing. Let's take a look at that Washington Post piece, which says, quote, Biden and some of his aides still believe he should have stayed in the race, despite the rocky debate performance and low poll numbers that prompted Democrats to pressure him to drop out. Biden and these aides have told people in recent days that he could have defeated Trump. According to people familiar with their comments who spoke in the condition of anonymity, describe private conversations. Aides say the president has been careful not to place blame on Harris or her campaign. Now, what's likely that would have not helped his campaign, Biden's reelection campaign, are these newly released photos from the National Archives showing Biden shaking hands and posing with Chinese businessmen alongside Hunter and his business associates during a December 2013 official trip to Beijing when Biden was vice president. Biden has long denied any involvement in his son's overseas business dealings.
I've never discussed my business or their business, my sons or daughters.
I've never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings.
I have never discussed with my son or my brother or anyone else anything having to do with their businesses, period.
Now, many Republicans have long claimed Biden has not been truthful with this matter, including James Comer yesterday on Sunday Morning Futures.
Joe Biden lied. He did, in fact, introduce his son to all these Chinese people. Joe Biden did, in fact, meet with all these Chinese people that were wiring his family millions of dollars for mysterious reasons. And we knew it, and I think the American people with common sense knew it.
Now, this trip, the White House reacting to these new photos, saying, quote, this trip, which occurred over a decade ago, is old news. House Republicans already wasted years and millions of taxpayer dollars, proving the president was not in business with his son. It's past time to call it a day. Hunter's lawyer also responding to these new photos, saying there's nothing new here about these new photos. Ladies, gentlemen, Tammy?
All righty, Lucas, thank you, sir, very much. And great assignment you've got there in St. Croix.
Yeah, right?
My goodness, the one thing,
Joe
Biden.
Tough job, Lucas.
Yeah, tough job. Thanks, Joe Biden. All right, well, look, what I find very interesting, Lisa, is this argument that he could have won, which is exclusively a statement about Kamala Harris. That's a statement about her. And then they say, oh, he doesn't want to make a statement about her. That is the thing that does. And it's interesting in that they believe that he would have, and I actually believe he would have been better, but that's how bad she was. And yet it doesn't mean he would have won. They're still putting the Trump victory in this context as an accident because of a decision they made. What's your take on that?
Well, he won the popular vote, right? So the American people were on his side. If the executives are listening, if Lucas needs a break, especially for the new year, I will gladly fly there and cover for him in St. Croix.
Yeah.
But to your point, look, the American people, I've been saying this. This was a rejection of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, the left, but this was also an election for Donald Trump, choosing his mandate, choosing the America First policy. The two most important defining dates in the election cycle were June 27th and July 13th. June 27th was when Donald Trump ended Joe Biden's career on the debate stage at CNN, where it was so bad that even the media had to admit that they were lying to us about cheap fakes. The left had to admit to us that, no, Joe Biden does not have all his faculties. And then, of course, July 13th, in the manner in which Donald Trump survived the Butler, Pennsylvania assassination attempt. Because Americans needed a fighter at the time, and they saw that in Donald Trump with the fight, 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 the USA. And then additionally, it dispelled this notion that he was the threat to democracy, because most people are thinking maybe the people trying to kill him are the threat to democracy.
Right.
So, no, I think Joe Biden would have lost by, bigger margins, and this was Donald Trump to always win.
It exposes a certain level of delusion. But, John, let me ask you about his remarks about Merrick Garland, where he felt that was a big mistake. Apparently, he was convinced to do it. Again, some of this article kind of gives a position that Biden was actively involved in some of these decisions, or was wandering around thinking about presidential theory and history and what should he do. Clearly, though...
That's my job, by the way.
Right, there you go. Ron Klain is reportedly the one who really pushed for Garland. But the argument, sir, was that they didn't prosecute Trump fast enough and shouldn't have gone after Hunter. So it still moves into a confirmation that it was lawfare that they were relying upon.
If you needed any proof that Biden was not mentally capable and should not have served a second term, it's comments like these. He was elected, if he had read the nation right, read the people right, he was elected to be a transitional figure. He instead thought he was a revolutionary figure like FDR or LBJ, and he was intent on breaking all kinds of norms to get there, and lawfare is the best example. How can someone think the best thing for the country would have been to prosecute your leading rival, with all the powers of the federal government behind you, to produce an electoral outcome? That is the first time in American history that's ever happened. It's terrible for the country. He has opened up a cycle of retaliation that is going to undermine our politics for years. His family's going to experience it from all those pictures we saw of him glad-handing it with the Chinese. Congress and the U.S. attorney should be all over that in the next administration. But that, to me, shows that he's putting himself before the best interests of the country. If we talk about whether Carter was a good president or not, Carter didn't put himself before the country. Biden saying it would have been better for him to be president another 4 years in his mentally diminished state when aides were covering up for him for years, and then that I should have prosecuted Donald Trump in 2021 shows that he actually didn't have the best interests of his own country at heart.
You know, it could be an argument that Carter was perhaps the first example of where aides and the left had moved into the nature of what the president would do and where they felt that they were the president, Molly, not the president, because, you know, he handed over the Panama Canal, established the Department of Education and the Department of Energy, massive government expansion, of course, leading to more spending, massive inflation. I mean, it's an argument there. But here you've got, you know, speaking of the photos of him with the Chinese associates, effectively introducing them, it appears, to Hunter. It's one thing to say that, you know, we've looked at his accounts and there was no money, but there's the power of being vice president, and then president is what I've argued, has informed that relationship because of his position as president.
Yeah,
now we know.
Yeah, on this post-mortem that continues, a personal post-mortem, it's almost into a forlorn fantasy now. We're digging through this article, you know, and it's time to move beyond that. And then when you see a photo like this coming out, this really remarkable photo, where the heck has this photo been? Why wasn't all of this out when the House and the Republicans were trying to get to the bottom of all this? Hunter's lawyer, Lowell, reacted to this saying there's simply nothing new here. And
Which is true.
Point. And I think, the other side of the aisle could very well agree to that. This is something we've seen before, and we should have seen this photo long ago, and there should have been questions asked about it and answered about it. And likely, as you mentioned, John, there may very well be more questions to come. So to the extent it just reinvigorates what we've already known and what Republicans have been alleging and looking into, and the questions about influence peddling continuing.
You know, Nicole, this also, though, reminds the American people that things were kept from us, right? Even Obama joined in his team in the lawsuit to keep these photographs in the National Archives, which has become obviously very politicized as well. But this is not good for the legitimacy of the government, of what the impact is on now what the American people are watching unfold in the aftermath.
Well, the secrecy of this presidency, from the ties with Hunter Biden and all of his business connections to President Biden's mental and physical fitness, I mean, all of this was hidden from the American people for the last 4 years. And Democrats are finding themselves in this shoulda, coulda, woulda moment, and they're starting to point fingers. The bottom line, Harris campaign, Biden campaign, neither were prepared for the Goliath of the Trump campaign, which really used the media effectively to their benefit, and they connected with the American people. They acknowledged what the people were needing to hear right now. Maybe in 2022, you know, as John was mentioning, President Biden was supposed to be a transitional president. He had alluded to he would do a term and then give it to the next generation. But I don't know if it was narcissism or what it was that kept him to run again. But that was what happened. And they were going to lose. They staged a coup. They put in Kamala Harris, who the Democrats themselves rejected in 2019. They rejected her before Republicans can. They have no one to blame but themselves. President Trump ran an excellent campaign, and he's exactly what the American people wanted.
We're watching this play out in front of people, which is also a mistake. So they usually have discipline, but not now. All right.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.